Today, we're going to talk about tomatoes, specifically indeterminate tomatoes. There are literally thousands of tomato videos that you could be watching. So what makes this one different? Well, two things. First of all, I didn't plant one single tomato seed this year, not one, but we have tons of tomatoes growing all over our garden, and they were absolutely free. Want to know how? We'll get to that in just a moment. The second thing is some questions I've been getting from newer gardeners about when to pinch back their first flowers and when and how to prune. So today I want to demonstrate how I prune my tomatoes to single stems and exactly why. Now, I mentioned that today we're going to talk about indeterminate tomatoes, and that's because that is primarily what I grow. If you are new to gardening and becoming overwhelmed with the cost of getting started, and you're beginning to wonder if it's worth it, I'm here to show you that it is. And there are so many ways to save on your gardening, especially in future years. If you want to know more about how to save money gardening, there is a link in the description to get my free guide. I hope you'll share the link or this video with anyone that you know that's new to gardening and looking to get started on a budget. So let's talk about the importance of single stemming and why I choose to grow my tomatoes that way. So first of all, tomatoes are very prone to disease. Especially here in Oklahoma, we get a ton of rain, and that's one reason why they are so prone to disease. So airflow is extremely important. Pruning helps a lot to produce a healthier plant. But first, you need to understand the anatomy of the plant so you can feel confident when you are pruning and why. But before we get into that, let's talk about how I wound up with so many plants this year without having to plant a single one. Last year, we had an incredible amount of rain, and a lot of my tomatoes had split early in the season. I knew a lot of the tomatoes had dropped into the soil, so that was a lot of seeds falling into the soil. So I expected that we would have a lot of plants that had self-seeded. This is also known as a volunteer plant, which just means it's a plant that has popped up on its own, whether from a plant dropping seeds or the wind or birds. So this spring, as I was planning out my garden layout, I knew there really wasn't anywhere in my main garden where I could grow tomatoes this year because I highly rely on crop rotation, and we'll get into that more later. But I did have tomatoes in practically every bed in my main garden last year, except for the terrace garden. But I also knew I could expect to see a lot of tomato volunteers from what had fallen in the previous year. So I made a plan pretty early on to just pluck up those plants and move them to the south garden to bed number 2, which I had already designated as my tomato growing area for this year. So as they have popped up in the main garden, I have just dug those up, moved them to the south garden, and gotten them started that way. Not only that, but I'm going to show you another trick here in just a moment to maximize your tomato crop. I've been working on this video for over a month now, but I think you are going to love everything I'm showing you here. We are starting on May 14th. You're going to get to see the life cycle of a tomato plant in its first 30 days. We are in the south garden, and I'm going to show you how I'm pruning this tomato plant to a single stem. First, I'm trimming these lower leaves because any leaves close to the soil like this are going to be the ones that are most at risk for soil-borne disease. But when we prune these, you can actually start a whole new plant from this cutting. We're taking 2 cuttings today, and you're going to get to see how these grow over the next month. Now, I'm wanting you to notice how we are on the inside of this bed. You can see that wooden stake there leaning up against the cattle panel trellis. You can also see some other little seedlings that I had popped up front, as well as some ground cherry seedlings. Okay, now we are on the other side so that we can better access this tomato plant. And do you see right here, these are suckers that I'm pruning off. I'm only replanting the ones that are larger, and you can see I've cleaned off the rest of those bottom leaves. And here in a moment, I'm going to clean off some more of these sun leaves here. But I want to show you, this is how you identify your main stem. If you follow from the ground up, you can see whichever stem has flowers on it first, that is your main stem. That's a sun leaf that I'm touching. So right there in that little elbow, that is a sucker that I didn't prune. We're going to cut that off and we're going to plant it up. So that is our free plant number 2 that I'm popping in right here in the corner of this bed. So we're going to keep on watching this over the next month as well. I'm going to continue pruning the rest of the suckers and the lower leaves off of this plant. But I also want you to notice there were several ground cherry volunteer plants all over the place in that bed, plus a few other little suckers that I'd popped in the ground. We will get those cleaned up. But for right now, I want to show you, see right here in that little elbow, that would be another sucker. So if I had left it alone, just like the second one here, it would have gotten bigger. But we're going to cut all of those off until we've just got a single stem. We're going to leave a lot of the sun leaves because that's how the plant gets its energy. But we're going to cut off some of the lower leaves, the ones that are closest to the ground. Now, here's a look at our main plant after we have trimmed it up and cleaned it all up. Here's free plant number 2, and we're going to keep an eye on these for the next month. And check out all those leaves we cut off. Remember to compost those, especially because they are not diseased, so they are excellent for the compost bin. And now we have jumped forward to May 18th, so this is 4 days later. So you can see here where I trimmed off all of the sun leaves underneath the flower stem. So notice that lowest flower stem, this one right here is the second set of flowers up. Okay, we are on the other side of the plant now, or the other side of the trellis so that you can see the plant better. Oh, there's your flowers right there. But this is where we pruned that sucker. That was plant number 2 that we stuck in the soil over there. And another tip you need to know about is tomato flowers are self-pollinating, but it is a good idea to kind of shake your plant a little bit, not violently or anything, but I just kind of tickled them, I guess you could say, to get the flowers well pollinated. Okay, now while I continue pruning off the suckers, let's talk about why you might want to prune your tomato plants this way. Now keep in mind, this is only for indeterminate tomatoes because determinate tomatoes grow a whole different way. But for indeterminates, they keep growing and growing until a frost kills them off or disease. Everywhere that you have a sun leaf in that elbow, you will get a sucker. And if you let those suckers go, you can imagine you're going to have multiple plants growing from that main stem. So the first reason, as I've already mentioned, to single stem is for airflow, which produces a healthier plant. And now we have jumped all the way ahead to May 27th. Now here is how I kind of tickle my tomato flowers to make sure that they get pollinated. There's another large tomato plant down at that end, but we haven't looked at that one yet. And then there is that first plant, the first sucker that we took. And then number 2 back over there on the other side of the trellis, getting big. And right now they are completely surrounded by ground cherries, and we're going to take care of that in just a little bit. But check out our original plant. Remember that first stem of tomatoes? And now we are jumping to June 3rd. It has now been nearly 3 weeks. Now let's talk more about single stemming. Yes, you can let your suckers go and have a big bushy plant if you would like. But when you do that, it does take the plant longer to ripen those earlier tomatoes. The plant is having to put a lot of energy into growing these suckers into a whole other plant that develops flowers to eventually fruit. So by pruning the suckers, the plant continues focusing its energy on ripening its existing fruit. So there is the first sucker that we had planted on May 14th. It's basically been 3 weeks since we stuck this in the soil. And see there? It's just now starting to develop its first set of flowers. But remember, this sucker was much smaller than the second sucker we pruned. And look at that. It already has a sucker growing on this plant. So imagine how many suckers a plant would produce if you didn't prune it at all. You'd have a big mess. Now we're on the other side. Even with my best efforts to stay on top of this plant, you can see how fast new growth can get out of hand. But look right here. That's the spot where we pruned our second sucker on May 14th. And look at all those tomatoes just on this one plant. And you can see there are still a lot more flowers too. And here's that second sucker right here. See how much more mature it is than the first one? Because it was so much bigger to begin with. Now it's June 5th, and the surrounding plants are just taking up too much space. It's time to get them out of here so these tomatoes have some breathing room. There were a lot of ground cherry plants that I had to relocate. But look at those beautiful tomatoes. That's the original tomatoes, or well, those were the original flowers that we started this video off with. There's our first sucker, and it's doing so good. And we also have several other little seedlings that have popped up throughout that I've just popped in here until I can find pots for them. Oh, and this one right here, by the way, is what your suckers will first look like when you pop them in the ground for about 24 hours, but make sure you've watered them really good. And after about 24 to 48 hours, they do perk right back up. And we are now on the other side of the trellis. You can see what a big mess of ground cherry plants I've got there, plus a lot of basil, which I do recommend keeping basil growing near your tomato plants. It's always a good deterrent of the tomato hornworm. Let me know how you grow your tomato plants. Do you use single stem, or are you brand new to growing tomatoes? I would love to hear from you below. And remember, we have that beginner gardener guide linked in the description. Remember to go the second mile today for someone in your life and with your resources.